The first time I saw the letter, I thought it was junk mail. A white envelope tucked awkwardly between the handle of my front door and the screen, flapping slightly in the warm spring breeze. No return address, just bold block letters across the front. Notice of HOA violation. I remember laughing. A quick, disbelieving laugh that felt a little too loud for a Thursday morning. It was the kind of sound you make when you think someone's playing a joke. I'd lived in Cedar Ridge Estates for 4 years, and aside from the usual holiday newsletter or potluck invitation, I'd never heard a peep from the Homeowners Association. But that morning, with coffee still steaming in my travel mug and my lunch packed neatly for another day at the auto shop, I tore open the envelope and read words that would end up swallowing my entire summer. You are hereby notified that your property is in violation of Cedar Ridge Estates HOA Bylaw Section 4.12. Trash receptacles must be stored out of view from the street. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $50 per day beginning May 17th. I blinked, reading the sentence again. Trash receptacles? Stored out of view? I looked over my shoulder. My 2 green bins, one for trash, one for recycling, stood dutifully beside my garage door, exactly where they'd been since the day I moved in. I'd never given them a second thought. Neither had anyone else, apparently, until now. $50 a day? I muttered. You've got to be kidding me. I stuffed the notice into my back pocket and tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they sent it to the wrong house. But even as I drove to work, the words clung to the back of my mind like a splinter under the skin. By the time I got home that evening, another envelope was waiting, this time tucked under my doormat. Same block letters, same cold tone. Second notice. Your violation remains unresolved. Daily fines will begin in 48 hours. I stared at it, then at the bins, then at the street. Was this really happening? That night, I called the number listed at the bottom of the notice. After a few rings, a voice picked up, clipped and efficient. Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, this is Pamela. Yeah, hi, I said, pacing the kitchen. I just got a notice about my trash cans being out of view or something. There was a pause. And your name, sir? Ryan. Ryan Mitchell. Lot 32. I could practically hear her flipping pages on the other end. Yes. Lot 32. That's correct. Your receptacles are visible from the street. That's a violation of Bylaw 4.12. I pinched the bridge of my nose. They're beside my garage. They've been there for years. Well, someone brought it to our attention. Someone. I repeated. Who? I'm afraid I can't disclose that. I exhaled hard. Pamela, this is ridiculous. $50 a day? It's standard enforcement procedure, Mr. Mitchell, she interrupted, her voice still maddeningly calm. We recommend storing your bins in a garage, behind a fence, or otherwise out of sight. It's all outlined in the bylaws you received when you moved in. That was technically true. I had received a fat packet of HOA documents when I bought the house. But like most people, I'd stuffed it in a drawer and never looked at it again. Pamela wasn't done. If the violation isn't resolved by Saturday, the fines will begin. Is there anything else I can help you with today? No, I said, jaw tight. You've been so helpful. Friday afternoon, as I hauled my bins to the curb for pickup, I noticed a woman standing across the street. 60s, silver bob haircut, floral blouse buttoned to her throat, clipboard in hand. She watched me like a hawk as I lined the bins up next to the sidewalk. When I turned, she smiled, thin and tight, the kind of smile you give someone you don't actually like. Good afternoon, she called, walking over. You must be Ryan. I nodded cautiously. And you are? Margaret Whitfield. I'm the HOA president. Oh, of course. I assume you got our notices, she said, folding her hands over the clipboard. It's important to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The aesthetic, I repeated flatly. Cedar Ridge has standards, she continued, glancing pointedly at the bins. We all agreed to them when we moved in. You, me, everyone. And part of that means keeping unsightly items, like trash receptacles, out of view. They're trash cans, I said. Everyone has them. Not everyone leaves them where they can be seen, she corrected, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. Some of us care about property values. I felt my chest tighten. You're really gonna find me $50 a day over trash cans? She tilted her head, all mock sympathy. We don't want to fine you, Mr. Mitchell. We'd rather you just comply. I'm sure you understand. And with that, she walked away, clipboard tucked neatly under her arm, as if she hadn't just threatened me with financial ruin over a couple of green plastic bins. I spent that night pacing my living room, staring out the window at those bins. $50 a day. That was $350 a week. Over $1,000 a month. Over trash cans. This is insane, I muttered to myself. Completely insane. I could move them into the garage, I supposed. But that would mean dragging them through the side door every week, maneuvering around my workbench and shelves. It was possible, but it would also be giving in. And the thought of Margaret Whitfield smugly checking off a box on her clipboard made my blood boil. No, there had to be another way. By Sunday morning, the fines had begun. I found the invoice taped to my door, printed on crisp HOA letterhead. Violation ongoing. Current balance, $100. It felt like a punch to the gut. $100. For nothing. I stormed into the backyard, muttering under my breath. That's when I noticed my neighbor, Mike, leaning on the fence with a beer in his hand. Rough morning, he asked. HOA, I said. They're fining me for my trash cans now. He barked out a laugh. Oh, buddy. Welcome to the club. They ever come after you? He nodded toward his driveway. Basketball hoop. Said it was too close to the street. Took me 6 weeks and a lawyer to sort that out. Jesus. He took a sip of his beer. They live for this stuff. Margaret especially. You give her an inch, she'll build a mile-long fence on it. I sighed and ran a hand through my hair. There's got to be a way to beat them. Mike grinned. Short of moving? Good luck. But even as he said it, something started forming in the back of my mind. A spark. A ridiculous, probably impractical idea. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. That night, I pulled the HOA bylaws out of the dusty drawer I'd buried them in 4 years ago. I spread them across my kitchen table, highlighted sections, made notes in the margins. And somewhere around midnight, I found it. Trash receptacles must be stored out of view from the street when not on collection day. Out of view from the street. That was it. That was the entire rule. It didn't say they had to be behind a fence. It didn't say they had to be in a garage. Just out of view. I stared at those words until they burned into my brain. Out of view. That was all I needed. The next morning, I drove to Home Depot. I bought plywood, hinges, a shovel, and 3 bags of concrete mix. When the cashier asked what I was building, I smiled and said, a solution. For the next 2 weeks, every spare hour I had was spent digging, sawing, and sweating in the side yard beside my garage. The ground was stubborn, rocky in places, and more than once I cursed myself for even starting. But I kept going, kept picturing Margaret's pinched little smile and Pamela's smug, scripted voice. By the end of week 2, I had a rectangular pit about 3 feet deep and 6 feet long, just big enough for 2 trash cans. I lined it with plywood, poured a base of concrete for stability, and built a hinged wooden platform that sat flush with the grass. From the street, it looked like nothing more than a patch of yard. But beneath it, my very own hidden trash can vault. The first test came on a Tuesday evening. I wheeled the bins into the pit, lowered the platform over them, and stepped back. From the sidewalk, there was no sign of them. No green plastic, no lids peeking out, nothing. Just a neat rectangle of grass. I grinned. Out of view, I whispered. The next morning, I waited. 8 a.m. came and went. 9, 10. Then, around 10:30, Margaret's silver sedan rolled slowly down the street. I watched from my window as she craned her neck, scanning my driveway, her clipboard balanced on her lap. She slowed in front of my house. Stopped. Frowned. Then, for the first time since this whole nightmare started, she drove off without getting out of the car. The invoice stopped coming. No more fines. No more notices. The HOA website updated my status to compliant. It worked. My ridiculous, back-breaking, shovel-blistering plan had worked. I should have felt triumphant. Victorious, even. And I did for a while. But deep down, I knew Margaret wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, another envelope appeared on my doorstep. This one even colder, even more ominous than the first. Notice of inspection. A routine property review will be conducted on June 14th. Noncompliance will result in additional fines or legal action. They were coming to inspect my property, and if they found that pit, if they decided it was unauthorized landscaping or some other nonsense, it could all come crashing down. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling slightly. They weren't going to stop. They weren't going to let me win. But I wasn't about to lose, either. The days leading up to the inspection were some of the longest of my life. I barely slept. I kept tweaking the trapdoor, sealing edges, camouflaging it with turf. I practiced opening and closing it quickly, quietly. I rehearsed what I'd say if they asked questions. And yet, part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. If maybe I should have just shoved the bins into the garage and been done with it. My mom called one night, and when I told her about the pit, she laughed for a solid 30 seconds. "You buried your trash cans?" she said between giggles. "I hid them," I corrected. "Ryan, honey, you're starting to sound like your Uncle Dale. Remember the guy who built a moat to keep squirrels off his bird feeder?" "It's not the same thing," I said, though even I wasn't sure I believed it. "Just be careful, okay? These HOA types, they love a good fight." "Yeah," I muttered. "So do I." June 14th arrived with a cloudless sky and a knot in my stomach. At 10:03 a.m., a silver sedan and a navy SUV pulled into my driveway. Margaret climbed out of the sedan, clipboard in hand, and Pamela emerged from the SUV with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, suit too big for his frame. A lawyer, maybe. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Margaret said, her smile tight as ever. "We're here for your inspection." I stepped aside. "Be my guest." They started in the front yard, noting down God knows what about my lawn and hedges. Then they moved to the driveway, the garage, the fence line. Finally, they stopped at the spot where my bins had always stood. "Where are your receptacles, Mr. Mitchell?" Pamela asked. I gestured toward the garage. "Inside." "May we see them?" I shrugged. "Sure." I opened the side door and showed them the empty space near my workbench. Margaret frowned. "They're not here." "Nope." "Where are they?" Pamela pressed. "Out of view," I said, keeping my voice even. "Per bylaw 4.12. They exchanged glances. Margaret walked a slow circle around the yard, her eyes scanning every inch of grass. She even crouched down at one point, running her fingers over the turf above the trapdoor. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. But after several tense minutes, she sighed and snapped her clipboard shut. "Well," she said reluctantly, "it appears you're in compliance." "Appears so," I said, fighting to keep the smirk off my face. They left shortly after, their cars rolling silently down the street. I watched them go from my porch, my pulse finally slowing. I'd done it. I'd beaten them. Or so I thought. Because later that night, as I was locking up the house, I noticed something on my front door. Another envelope. No return address. Just those same cold block letters. And when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Notice of unauthorized structure. Potential violation of Cedar Ridge Estates Bylaw Section 7.3. Further investigation pending. They knew. Somehow they knew. And this time, they were coming for more than $50 a day. The letter burned in my hand like a live coal. Notice of unauthorized structure. Potential violation of Cedar Ridge Estates Bylaw Section 7.3. Further investigation pending. Unauthorized structure. They didn't even know what I'd built, but they suspected. And that was enough to send them after me again. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the letter lying flat in front of me, my laptop glowing faintly as I read and reread every line of that damn bylaw. Section 7.3 was about unauthorized modifications to property. Fences, sheds, decks, things that required HOA approval. Things I didn't technically build. Technically, I hadn't built a structure above ground. I hadn't changed the property's footprint. All I'd done was dig a hole and put my trash cans in it. Hell, if they wanted to be technical, I'd reduced visual clutter. But Margaret Whitfield didn't care about technicalities. She cared about control. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was about more than trash cans now. This was about me. About teaching me a lesson. About making sure nobody else in Cedar Ridge got the idea that they could push back. I wasn't about to roll over. Not now. Not ever. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived, official as hell, stamped and signed by the HOA board. A formal inspection of your property is scheduled for June 30th. Any unauthorized modifications must be removed before this date to avoid fines, legal action, or forced remediation at your expense. Forced remediation. I laughed bitterly at the phrase. That meant they were threatening to hire contractors to undo whatever I'd built and then charge me for it. I called Mike the minute I read it. They're trying to scare you, he said, sipping a beer on my porch. Classic Margaret move. Bluff first, then back it up with legalese. Think it's a bluff? He shrugged. Hard to say. If she really wants to make an example out of you, she might call in the county. Claim it's a hazard or something. Can she do that? Oh, buddy, he said, chuckling grimly. She will do that. I stared out across the street at Margaret's pristine colonial-style house. She was on her porch watering a row of petunias, her movements slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. And maybe she did. After all, she wasn't the one getting fined $50 a day or threatened with legal action. I clenched my jaw. If it's a war she wants, I muttered, I'll give her one. The next morning, I drove into town and started making calls. I talked to a friend of a friend who was a contractor, then a guy I knew from high school who worked in code enforcement, then a paralegal I met through Mike's brother. By the end of the day, I had a better understanding of my rights, and more importantly, their limits. The HOA had authority over aesthetics and community standards, sure, but they had no right to enter my property without permission. They couldn't force their way into my yard. And unless they had proof that I'd built something dangerous or illegal, they couldn't do a damn thing without going through the courts. And courts? Courts took time. Months, maybe longer. I smiled for the first time in days. Time was exactly what I needed. June 30th crept closer. The HOA board sent 2 more letters, each more threatening than the last. They cited fines. They hinted at legal costs. They even mentioned possible liens against my property. I ignored them all, but I didn't just sit still. No, I prepared. I reinforced the trapdoor with steel brackets. I installed a motion-activated sprinkler system around the area. Perfectly legal, but annoying as hell if someone tried snooping at night. I even put up a new bird feeder nearby to make the spot look more landscaped. And just for good measure, I set up a small camera on my porch, aimed squarely at the side yard. If Margaret or one of her cronies tried anything off the books, I'd have it on video. By the time June 30th rolled around, my yard looked ordinary, innocent, like nothing had ever been there at all. The inspection team arrived at 9:15 a.m. sharp. Margaret, Pamela, and a man in a gray suit I hadn't seen before. They introduced him as Mr. Carver, our compliance attorney. His smile was as thin and sharp as a paper cut. Mr. Mitchell, Margaret said, clipboard tucked under her arm. We're here to follow up on the matter of the unauthorized structure. Of course, I said, stepping aside. Go ahead. They combed the yard, poked around the garage, measured the fence line. Margaret lingered near the trapdoor again. Crouching so low, I thought she might press her ear to the grass. Nothing out of the ordinary, Pamela murmured after 20 minutes. Margaret wasn't satisfied. There's something here, she insisted, tapping her pen against her clipboard. I know there is. Know it or prove it, I said, my voice steady. Because if you're accusing me of violating Section 7.3, you're going to need more than gut feelings. Mr. Carver cleared his throat. We'll be conducting a soil survey. If we find evidence of excavation. Without a warrant? I asked. His lips twitched. It's in your HOA agreement. Actually, I said, holding up a copy of the bylaws I'd printed and highlighted. Section 7.3 covers visible structures. It says nothing about excavation. And Section 2.5 says no HOA representative may enter a homeowner's property without permission or a court order. Pamela blinked. Margaret's face turned a shade redder. Unless you've got either of those, I continued, this inspection is over. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mr. Carver nodded stiffly. We'll be in touch. They left without another word. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. But I also knew this wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the type to lick her wounds and walk away. If anything, I just poured gasoline on her fire. Sure enough, the next wave hit harder. A week later, I got a notice from the county zoning office. Someone, I wonder who, had reported that I'd altered the grade of my property without a permit. An inspector was scheduled to visit the following Thursday. This is next-level petty, Mike said when I told him. She's escalating. Let her, I said, though my stomach churned at the thought of county inspectors poking around. You really gonna stand your ground? Damn right I am. Then you better make sure that hole is bulletproof. I already had. The county inspection went differently. The guy who showed up, mid-40s, ball cap, coffee in hand, wasn't interested in HOA drama. He just wanted to see if I'd created a safety hazard or messed with drainage. I showed him the yard. He poked around with a metal rod, asked a few questions, scribbled some notes. You didn't pour a foundation? He asked. Nope. Any retaining walls or concrete structures? Nope. He scratched his head. Looks like a basic landscaping depression. You could call it a garden bed if you wanted. Exactly, I said, biting back a grin. He shrugged. Not my problem then. You're in the clear. When Margaret found out the county had cleared me, she lost it. I knew because 2 days later she showed up on my doorstep unannounced. No clipboard this time. Just fury radiating off her like summer heat. You think you're clever, don't you? She snapped the second I opened the door. Good morning to you too, Margaret. This isn't over. Seems like it might be, I said. County says I'm fine. Bylaws say I'm fine. Trash cans are out of view. Case closed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You're setting a dangerous precedent, Mr. Mitchell. If everyone started bending the rules, Cedar Ridge would fall apart. Or, I said, meeting her glare, maybe people are just tired of being bullied. Her lips tightened. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, smiling. But not today. She spun on her heel and stalked back to her car, tires squealing as she sped away. I watched her go, my heart hammering. Part of me was exhilarated. Another part was terrified. Because people like Margaret don't just give up. They regroup. They plot. And they come back harder. The next salvo was the dirtiest one yet. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find a lien notice taped to my front door. My stomach dropped as I read it. Due to ongoing violations and unpaid fines, the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA has voted to place a lien on your property in the amount of $1,350. Unpaid fines. I hadn't gotten an invoice in weeks. They'd stopped sending them after the inspection. How could I owe $1,350? I called Pamela immediately. What the hell is this? She sighed. The board determined that your unauthorized structure constitutes an ongoing violation. The fines have been accruing daily. You can't fine me for something you can't prove exists. That's for the courts to decide. And the lien? It's within our rights. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. My hands were shaking. A lien was serious. If it stuck, it could cloud the title on my house, make it impossible to sell, even lead to foreclosure if things escalated. That night, I stared at the trapdoor for a long time. I thought about digging it up, about surrendering, just to make the nightmare stop. But then I remembered Margaret's words, "You'll regret this." And something inside me hardened. No, not this time. Not ever. I spent the next few days researching HOA lawsuits. I read case after case of homeowners who'd fought back and won. I learned that most HOAs back down long before a case reaches court because they can't afford the legal fees. I learned that liens based on unproven violations often don't hold up. And I learned one more thing. Nothing scares an HOA like public attention. So I started planning something bigger. Something that would hurt them more than any legal motion could. I created a website, cedarridgestories.com. On it, I posted my story. Every letter, every fine, every threat. I invited other residents to share their experiences too. And boy, did they ever. Within a week, I had 15 stories. Then 30. Then over 60. People furious about lawn citations, paint color disputes, parking violations, all traced back to Margaret's iron-fisted leadership. I linked the site to a local Facebook group. It exploded overnight. Comments, shares, screenshots. The whole neighborhood was talking. Local reporters reached out. One even asked if I'd do an interview. Margaret must have seen it, because 2 days later, I got a very different letter in the mail. The Cedar Ridge Estates HOA has voted to suspend all fines pending review. We look forward to resolving this matter amicably. Amicably. That was rich. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because if Margaret thought a few kind words would make me forget what she'd done, she had another thing coming. And for the first time since this war began, I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was going on the attack. The ceasefire lasted exactly 9 days. 9 days without letters, without fines, without Margaret's silver sedan crawling past my driveway like a shark circling prey. 9 days where I almost believed they'd given up. But on the 10th day, I found a new notice wedged under my doormat. Notice of board hearing. Your case will be reviewed by the Cedar Ridge HOA board on July 20th. Attendance is strongly recommended. Continued noncompliance may result in legal action. Legal action. They weren't backing down. They were regrouping. I read the notice 3 times before folding it in half and slipping it into my back pocket. My pulse was steady, my breath calm. Because by then, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. And anger, when properly harnessed, is a powerful thing. They wanted a war. Then a war they would have, not on the HOA, but on them. On Margaret Whitfield. On Pamela. On the little circle of power-drunk retirees who thought they could bully people into submission. I'd been planning this for weeks, ever since that lien notice appeared on my door. I'd been digging deeper, gathering intel, and now it was time to put the plan into motion. The trash trapdoor? That was just my opening move. What I was about to do now, this was checkmate. The first step was simple: information. People like Margaret thrive in the shadows of vague authority. They count on homeowners being too busy or too scared to dig into the details. But I had time now, and I was done being scared. I started with public records. It's amazing how much you can find if you know where to look. HOA board members are often listed in county filings. Budgets, meeting minutes, vendor contracts, all public documents in my state. And buried deep in those records, I found what I was looking for: a pattern. Cedar Ridge had a landscaping contract with a company called Whitfield Outdoor Services. The name hit me immediately. Whitfield, as in Margaret Whitfield. Sure enough, a little more digging showed that the company was registered to her son, Aaron Whitfield. The HOA was paying $42,000 a year to a company owned by Margaret's family. A company that, as far as I could tell, had no office, no website, and exactly one truck, which I'd seen parked in Margaret's driveway every other weekend. It was a classic conflict of interest. And in most states, it was also grounds for removal from an HOA board. I smiled as I bookmarked the document. That was card number 1. Card number 2 came from a man named David Cross. David had lived in Cedar Ridge for nearly 20 years, and he'd had his own run-ins with Margaret over the years, mostly about his flagpole being too tall and his porch lights being too bright. He was a grizzled old Navy vet with a wicked sense of humor and, more importantly, a good memory. Over a couple of beers in his backyard, David told me something that made my ears perk up. "She's been bending rules since she took over," he said. "Last year, they fined me for not trimming my hedges, but when I asked for the official landscaping guidelines, they couldn't produce them. Turns out they never filed them with the county." "Wait," I said, leaning forward. "They're supposed to?" "Of course. Any HOA landscaping standard has to be submitted and approved before it's enforceable. They just never bothered." I felt my grin widen. "So technically, they can't enforce a damn thing," David finished. Card number 2, invalid bylaws. But the third card? That one came from sheer luck. It was a Saturday morning, about a week before the hearing, when I saw Pamela across the street, talking animatedly to a woman I didn't recognize. I didn't pay much attention, not until Pamela's voice rose just enough for me to hear. "I told Margaret not to write that off under HOA expenses," she hissed. "If anyone looks closely, we're screwed." My head snapped up. "Write that off." I grabbed my phone and opened the HOA's latest financial report, another public document. And there it was, plain as day. Community engagement event, $4,750. I knew damn well there hadn't been any community events in months. Now I had embezzlement, or at the very least, misappropriation of funds. Card number 3. The trap was ready. All I had to do was spring it. July 20th arrived with blistering heat and a heavy electric tension. The hearing was held in the community clubhouse, the same beige, overly air-conditioned building where we'd voted for board members and hosted potlucks. Only this time, the folding chairs were arranged like a courtroom. Margaret sat at the front table in a crisp lavender blouse, Pamela at her right, Mr. Carver the attorney at her left. About 24 homeowners filled the chairs behind me, murmuring quietly. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret said as I entered, her tone smooth and cold. "Thank you for attending." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Bylaws read into record, violation history reviewed, the lien mentioned like a sword dangling over my head. Margaret's voice dripped with faux civility as she laid out the board's concerns. And then it was my turn. "Mr. Mitchell," Mr. Carver said, "do you wish to address the board?" "I do," I said, rising to my feet, "because I have a few concerns of my own." I took a deep breath and turned to face the room, not just the board, but the neighbors behind me. For months, this board has harassed me over trash cans, $50 daily fines, threats of legal action, a lien on my home, all because of an alleged violation they can't prove exists. Margaret shifted in her chair. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm not done," I said, cutting her off. "Because here's the thing. The bylaws say trash receptacles must be out of view. They are. End of story. Everything else has been retaliation." Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret opened her mouth, but I held up a stack of papers. "And that's not all. I've been doing some reading, and I've discovered that this board has been violating its own bylaws for years." Mr. Carver frowned. "Excuse me. Bylaw Section 9.1, Conflict of Interest Disclosures. Cedar Ridge Estates pays over $40,000 a year to Whitfield Outdoor Services. That company is owned by Margaret Whitfield's son. No disclosure, no competitive bids, no transparency. That's a violation of state HOA law." The room buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Margaret's cheeks flushed crimson. "That's not relevant," she started, but I didn't stop. Bylaw Section 5.3, Landscaping standards must be filed with the county to be enforceable. Guess what? Cedar Ridge's standards were never filed. That means every single landscaping fine issued in the last 6 years is invalid. Now the murmurs turned into outright chatter. Homeowners were pulling out their phones, whispering to each other. Pamela looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. "And finally," I said, raising the final sheet of paper, "there's the matter of this line item. For $1,750 for a community engagement event, that never happened. I don't know where that money went, but I know where it didn't go, and I think the state attorney general's office would love to know too." Dead silence. You could have heard a pin drop. I took a step closer to the table, locking eyes with Margaret. "You want to drag me into court over a hole in my yard? Fine. But understand this. The minute you do, every one of these documents becomes part of the public record. And if that happens, it won't just be me fighting you. It'll be every homeowner in this neighborhood, and probably a state investigator too." For a long, delicious moment, no one spoke. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a voice shouted, "Is that true, Margaret?" Another chimed in, "I want to see the landscaping contract." Then another, "I got fined for my hedges. Are you saying it was bogus?" Margaret's control was slipping fast. Her carefully curated authority was unraveling right there in the fluorescent glow of the clubhouse. "Order," she barked, banging her palm on the table. "Order." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. People were standing, shouting, demanding answers. And in the middle of the chaos, Margaret's composure finally cracked. "This is outrageous," she shouted at me. "You're trying to smear me." "I'm just reading your own records," I said calmly. "If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear." Mr. Carver leaned toward her, whispering urgently. Margaret's jaw clenched. Pamela stared down at the table, pale and silent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret exhaled sharply and slammed her pen onto the table. "This hearing is adjourned," she snapped. We'll revisit this matter." And just like that, she stormed out. No further explanation, no ruling, no smug smile. Pamela followed, and then Mr. Carver, leaving behind a room full of angry homeowners and one very satisfied man standing at the center of it all. Me. The fallout started immediately. By the next morning, the HOA's website was down. 2 days later, a notice went out announcing an emergency board meeting. Rumors swirled. Margaret was stepping down. Pamela might resign. There would be a financial audit. People who had paid landscaping fines were already demanding refunds. Mike came by that evening with a six-pack and a grin. "You lit a fire under them, man." "I just showed them a mirror," I said. "Think she'll quit?" "She'll fight it," I said. "People like her always do. But she's bleeding now. And once people smell blood—" I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. On July 28th, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Not an envelope. A letter. One page, printed, signed by Margaret herself. "Mr. Mitchell, after careful review, the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA has decided to rescind all fines and remove the lien on your property. Your account is now in good standing. Sincerely, Margaret Whitfield, HOA President." No apology. No explanation. Just surrender, thinly disguised as bureaucracy. I pinned it to my fridge and stared at it for a long time, a slow smile spreading across my face. But as satisfying as it was, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Margaret wasn't done. Not yet. And neither was I. Because I hadn't built that trapdoor just to hide trash cans. I'd built it to remind myself of something. Even the smallest act of defiance, if done right, can become a weapon. And I was just getting started. The morning after the confrontation in Margaret's driveway felt different. The air was still sharp with autumn cold, but it carried a quietness Ryan hadn't felt in months. No barking HOA emails, no passive-aggressive flyers, no lurking figures counting how many inches his trash cans were from the curb. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, his cul-de-sac felt like his own street again. But this wasn't over, not yet. Margaret Cole had been publicly humiliated, yes, but Ryan knew her type. She wasn't the kind to slink away quietly. People like her didn't lose. They schemed, they spun stories, they played the victim. If he was going to end this once and for all, he needed to drive the final nail into the coffin. And he had just the plan. The HOA's emergency board meeting was called for that Thursday evening. Margaret had sent out the notice herself, using the usual cold, authoritative tone, attendance mandatory. Important governance matters will be addressed. Ryan smirked as he read it. She was still clinging to the illusion of control. But this meeting wouldn't go the way she planned. He arrived early and stood at the back of the HOA's rented community hall, arms folded, watching neighbors trickle in. Normally, these meetings were quiet affairs with maybe a dozen retirees and the usual complainers. But tonight, nearly everyone had shown up. Word of Margaret's trash can crusade, and the footage Ryan had quietly leaked had spread like wildfire. The room buzzed with low, angry murmurs. $50 a day? For trash cans. She's been pocketing fines. I heard it from the treasurer herself. Can they even do that without a vote? Ryan's phone buzzed. A text from Lisa, the HOA treasurer he'd spoken with after the showdown. "Lisa, I'm sitting front row. Got the documents ready. When you speak, I'll back you up." Perfect. Phase 1 was in place. Margaret swept into the room 5 minutes late, dressed like a politician on debate night. Navy pantsuit, pearl earrings, a stiff smile plastered on her face. She scanned the crowd, clearly startled by the turnout, then spotted Ryan in the back. Her smile faltered for just a second. "Good evening, everyone," she began, tapping the microphone. "I'm glad so many of you came tonight. We have several pressing matters to discuss, including, like how you've been extorting homeowners for trash cans," a voice shouted from the second row. The room erupted with murmurs and scattered applause. Margaret's smile tightened. "That's not on the agenda tonight," she said carefully. "But since there seems to be some confusion, I'll address it briefly. The trash can regulations exist to maintain the community's property values and visual appeal. Violations result in fines as outlined in our bylaws." Ryan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "That's a nice speech, Margaret. But maybe you can explain why your signature is on fine notices that were never approved by the board, or why those fines ended up in a private account under your name." The room went silent. Margaret's eyes widened. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "That's a serious accusation." "Oh, I know," Ryan said, "which is why I brought evidence." He walked to the front, pulled a small stack of papers from his messenger bag, and handed them to Lisa. She held them up for the room to see. "These," Lisa said, her voice trembling but resolute, "are bank statements and transaction logs from the HOA's account. Or rather, from two accounts. One is our official fund. The other is a personal account Margaret opened under the name Cole Community Maintenance. That's where the trash can fines, and several others, were going." Gasps rippled through the hall. "That's a lie," Margaret snapped. "Lisa, you're overstepping." "Save it," Lisa said, her voice stronger now. "I'm the treasurer. I see every dollar. And I've already submitted this documentation to the county's HOA oversight office." The crowd erupted. People stood, shouting questions, accusations, demands. Margaret tried to regain control of the meeting, banging the gavel and shouting for order, but it was useless. "Did you pocket my fines too? You told us it was all going to landscaping. You're a thief." Ryan stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You could have just left me alone. $50 a day, you thought that would scare me. But you picked the wrong guy to bully." Her face twisted with rage and fear. "You don't know what you've done." "Oh, I do," he said, stepping back. "I stopped a tyrant." By the end of that chaotic meeting, the board had done something unprecedented. They voted, unanimously, to remove Margaret Cole as president, pending investigation. Her resignation was effective immediately. An interim board was appointed on the spot, and one of their first acts was to suspend all outstanding fines and launch a full audit. Margaret didn't even stay to hear the vote. She stormed out halfway through, face pale, eyes burning holes into Ryan as she passed. But the look wasn't triumph. It was pure, helpless hatred. Ryan watched her go, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and calm. It was over. Really over. 2 weeks later, an unmarked envelope showed up in Ryan's mailbox. Inside was a single piece of paper, a terse letter from Margaret's lawyer threatening defamation charges. He laughed out loud and tossed it straight into the trash. Empty threats. The documents Lisa had submitted were already in the hands of state regulators. Margaret was facing something far more serious than a neighborhood spat now. Life on Sycamore Ridge Lane began to change. Without Margaret's constant policing, people started relaxing. Flags appeared on porches again. A couple of families repainted their homes without fear of a fine. And Ryan, for the first time since moving in, felt proud of the little cul-de-sac he called home. But he wasn't quite done yet. One crisp Saturday morning, he invited a few neighbors over for coffee and donuts. People he'd barely spoken to before showed up, retirees, young families, even Lisa. They gathered in his driveway, chatting and laughing, the tension that once clung to the street now gone. "So," Ryan said, clearing his throat, "I've got an idea." They turned to listen. "You know that little patch of land behind the mailboxes? The one Margaret always said we couldn't use because it was unsightly?" There were nods and groans. "What if we turn it into a community garden? Everyone chips in. We make it beautiful. And it's something we all decided on, not because some power-hungry HOA president said so." For a second, there was silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon, the whole group was nodding and smiling. "Let's do it," Lisa said. "It's about time this neighborhood was ours again." Ryan felt something tighten in his chest, something warm and fierce. Victory didn't always look like fireworks and fanfare. Sometimes it looked like a simple Saturday morning, with neighbors laughing over donuts and planning something together for the first time. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light over the street, Ryan walked around back and lifted the hatch on his hidden trash can compartment, the one that had started all this madness. The can sat neatly inside, hidden from view, as if daring anyone to care. He grinned. It was more than just a clever solution now. It was a symbol of the battle he'd fought, the lines he'd refused to cross, and the quiet power of standing up for yourself when everyone tells you to back down. Margaret Cole had tried to crush him with $50 a day fines. She'd tried intimidation, humiliation, and fear. And in the end, all she'd done was reveal the weakness of people who build their power on control. Ryan had built something stronger, something they couldn't fine, bully, or legislate away. A trapdoor, a truth, and a community that refused to be ruled by fear. 3 months later, the HOA held its first election under the new leadership. Ryan didn't run for president. He didn't want the power. But when neighbors nominated him for vice president, he accepted. Not because he craved control, but because he'd learned something Margaret never understood. Power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. And this time, he was determined that the HOA would serve the people, not the other way around. On the night of the election, as ballots were counted and the new board sworn in, Ryan stood by the refreshment table, coffee in hand, watching neighbors laugh and talk without fear. Lisa approached, holding 2 cups of cider. "Vice President Carter," she teased, "has a nice ring to it." He chuckled. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. My biggest policy is going to be, don't be jerks." She raised her cup. "To not being jerks." He clinked his coffee against her cider. "I'll drink to that." A week later, a moving truck pulled into Margaret's old house. Rumor had it she'd sold the place quietly, hoping to escape the cloud of scandal. No one knew where she was headed, and no one seemed to care. Ryan watched from his porch as the new family unloaded boxes. A young couple, 2 kids, a golden retriever. They waved at him, and he waved back, smiling. The street was changing, and for once, it was changing for the better. As the last of the evening lights spilled across Sycamore Ridge Lane, Ryan took a deep breath. He thought about the man he'd been when this all started, tired, frustrated, ready to give in. And then he thought about the man he was now, calm, resolute, unafraid. All because of a trash can and a trapdoor. A few nights later, as he sat on his porch swing, his son climbed into his lap. "Dad," the boy asked, "are we going to build something else with trapdoors?" Ryan laughed. "Maybe." "What?" "'Cause you're really good at it." He smiled, hugging his son close. "Nah, kiddo. You know what I'm really good at." "What?" "Not letting bullies win." The boy thought about that for a second, then nodded. "That's even cooler." Ryan looked out over his quiet, peaceful street. No HOA patrols, no fines, no fear. Just families living their lives. And for the first time since this all began, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Margaret Cole had tried to bury him under fines and fear. Instead, she'd buried herself. Ryan Carter had built a trapdoor, and through it, he'd found not just victory, but freedom. And that was worth a hell of a lot more than $50 a day. If you enjoyed this intense story, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping, cinematic tales. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss the next thriller. Your support keeps these stories coming.